Maggie Thompson adjusted her seatbelt for what felt like the 100th time, though the plane had only been taxiing on the runway for a few minutes. Seat 9B on Flight 472 was hardly a throne of importance. It was just another middle-row seat, nestled between a chatty couple arguing about movies and a young man who had his headphones cranked so loud that Maggie could hear the bass reverberate through her ribcage. She tried to tune it out, staring at the small oval window beside her. Outside, the world was gray and foreboding. Heavy clouds churned and collided, swirling as though they were alive, forewarning a storm that had nothing to do with weather. Maggie's knuckles whitened as she gripped the armrest. Her heart pulsed in rhythm with the engine's warming, an anxious cadence that had nothing to do with flying. She had flown hundreds of times, but there was something about this flight, this plane, this moment that felt different. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the nagging sensation that she was about to be pulled from anonymity into something far bigger than herself. Around her, the hum of conversations and the shuffling of carry-ons created a cocoon of ordinary chaos. A flight attendant brushed past, smiling politely, offering a blanket to a sleeping passenger, unaware that the small plane was already holding secrets far beyond any passenger manifest. Maggie's eyes flicked to her worn leather backpack under the seat in front of her. It was ordinary on the outside, but she knew what it contained, items she had thought she would never need again. Tools, gadgets, and codes she had mastered long ago, during a life that had ended quietly the day she left her training program. Nobody had noticed her leave. Nobody had missed her. She leaned back, taking a deep breath. It was going to be just another flight. Ordinary, predictable, safe. That was the lie she told herself. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm and professional, but carrying an undertone that made the hairs on Maggie's arms rise. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Flight 472 is preparing for departure. We expect some turbulence along our route due to a weather front moving in. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and remain seated until further notice." The words were routine, but something in the cadence, the hesitation just behind the practiced tone, set Maggie on edge. She glanced around at her fellow passengers. None of them seemed to notice anything amiss. Parents soothed fussy children. Business travelers scrolled through their phones. An elderly man snored softly in seat 10A. The world continued as normal, as if the storm outside could never touch them. Maggie's mind wandered to the small details she always noticed. The slight tension in the flight attendant's jaw, the way the co-pilot tapped the dashboard with repeated, almost nervous rhythm. Her instincts prickled. She had learned to notice these things years ago, during long hours of drills and exercises that had taught her to read people, read machines, and read situations before they turned deadly. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft click of the intercom again, this time followed by a voice not intended for the passengers, a voice that somehow reached only her, though she had no idea why. "Alpha Raven, code Echo 9. Now." Maggie froze, her forked breath caught in her throat. She looked around, bewildered. No one else reacted. The young man with the headphones bobbed his head to music. The couple continued their petty argument about streaming services. Yet somewhere deep in her chest, a buried memory pulsed to life. Alpha Raven, Echo 9. The code name she had thought she'd left behind, the exercises, the missions, the intense hours spent learning to respond when everything else failed. Her pulse raced as disbelief and fear collided with a strange, adrenaline-fueled recognition. How could they know? How could anyone know she had ever existed in that other life? She had been careful, hidden under a mundane exterior for years. Nobody in this seat, in this row, in this plane could ever have guessed. Nobody except the pilot, or whoever had reached out across the hum of the engines and the chatter of passengers to call her by a name that existed only in shadows. Maggie's hands shook slightly as she clutched the armrest. Her backpack, so innocuous, suddenly seemed like a lifeline. She felt an almost magnetic pull toward it. She opened her bag just enough to see the contents, the small black gadget, the emergency codes, the papers and devices that she had meticulously carried with her for years. She hadn't used them in a long time. She had hoped never to need them again. But now, in the middle of row 9, surrounded by oblivious strangers, she knew she might not have a choice. The plane shuddered slightly on the runway, a subtle tremor that could have been turbulence or just the engines warming. Maggie's ears rang as she tried to steady her breathing. Something was coming. Something had already started. And she, the quiet, unnoticed passenger in seat 9B, was the only one who could respond. Her gaze flicked to the flight attendant again. The woman's eyes had widened slightly at some internal cue not visible to the passengers, a hesitation that screamed, "Something is wrong." Maggie felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She was just a nobody, a ghost from a past life that nobody remembered. And yet, for reasons she could not yet fathom, she had been called to act, called to save lives. Somewhere in the cockpit, the pilot spoke again. This time, the words were almost drowned out by the engines, yet Maggie heard them clearly, as if the universe itself had bent its rules just for her. "Alpha Raven, we're counting on you." Her stomach twisted. She felt a wave of panic, quickly tempered by the calm precision drilled into her during long-ago missions. She swallowed hard, shaking her head in disbelief. They can't know. They can't possibly know. And yet the truth pressed against her like the storm clouds outside the window, undeniable, urgent, inescapable. Maggie's fingers hovered over her bag, over the small, hidden gadget, over the tools of a life she thought she had abandoned. She took a deep breath, knowing that the next decision she made could define not only her life, but the lives of everyone aboard Flight 472. And as the plane began its slow, uneasy taxi toward the runway, a sudden jolt shook the fuselage. Not strong enough to topple anyone, not yet, but enough to make passengers glance nervously at each other, enough to make Maggie's heart leap into her throat. The ordinary flight she had boarded moments ago had already ended. Row 9B, seat 9B, the nobody in the middle of the plane, Maggie Thompson, was about to be drawn into a story none of the passengers could even imagine. And in the cockpit, a single phrase echoed, carrying through the metal shell, piercing through the hum of engines and the chatter of oblivious travelers. "Alpha Raven, it's now or never." Maggie swallowed hard, her mind racing. The storm outside wasn't just weather. The storm inside had just begun. Maggie's pulse thundered in her ears, her fingers curling around the armrest until her knuckles ached. "Alpha Raven, code Echo 9 now." The words were more than a whisper. They were a summons from a life she thought she had abandoned, a life hidden beneath the hum of ordinary existence. For a moment she froze, paralyzed by disbelief and fear. How could the pilot know? How could anyone possibly know she had ever existed in that other world? A world of secret missions, coded communication, and life-or-death decisions. Her mind raced. She had left it all behind, the training, the operations, the missions she had executed flawlessly, always in the shadows, always unnoticed. She had reinvented herself as a nondescript office worker, a nobody in the middle row of a commercial plane. Nobody had any reason to suspect her past, nobody except the pilot now. The intercom clicked again, soft but deliberate. The captain's voice was tense, clipped, and laced with an urgency that made Maggie's stomach twist. "Alpha Raven, it's happening. Lives are on the line. We need you now." She glanced up at the flight attendant walking down the aisle, frozen mid-step, eyes wide as if she too had heard the name. Maggie's breath hitched. Nobody else seemed to notice. The oblivious passengers chatted, scrolled through their phones, or dozed with earbuds in place. But the hidden language of the cockpit, the call to action, had reached her and only her. Maggie's hands flew instinctively to her backpack under the seat, unzipping it to reveal the sleek black device she had carried for years. It was small, unassuming, but it contained the tools necessary to interface with the plane's emergency systems, override certain controls, and if everything went perfectly, avert disaster. Her chest tightened as she realized the enormity of the moment. She had trained for emergencies like this countless times, but never with lives literally in the balance, never surrounded by civilians who had no idea what was coming. She wasn't just performing a drill. She was stepping back into a life she thought she had left behind forever. A violent jolt rattled the plane, throwing Maggie forward. The overhead compartments clattered, a few drinks toppled, and screams broke out from the rows ahead. Maggie pressed herself back against the seat, heart hammering, as the storm outside began to assert itself in the cabin. Lightning illuminated the terrified faces around her. The pilot's voice came again, more strained this time. "Alpha Raven, we have a critical engine alert. I can't stabilize it from here. You know what to do, please." The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. She had left the precision and discipline of her former life behind for anonymity, yet the universe had thrust her back into the center of chaos. The plane's engines hummed ominously, each vibration resonating in her chest like a drum of impending doom. Her fingers brushed the device in her bag, feeling the cold metal under her fingertips. Training took over where fear failed. She pulled out the black console, a compact laptop-like device, and tapped into the plane's emergency system with hands that were steady despite the adrenaline pumping through her veins. Her heart pounded, but her mind focused with surgical clarity. She scanned the dashboard of information that mirrored the cockpit's readouts: engine status, fuel lines, communication channels. The pilot's warning had not been an exaggeration. One of the engines was failing. Maggie remembered the drills, the sequences, the codes, the overrides. Muscle memory kicked in, every tap and keystroke precise. She could hear the co-pilot shouting to the captain, but the words faded into the background. Time narrowed into a razor-focused tunnel of awareness. She was the only line between catastrophe and survival. Suddenly, another jolt. The plane pitched violently, tossing passengers in their seats. A child cried, a woman screamed, and Maggie's heart constricted. The plane's internal lights flickered for a heartbeat, then returned. The storm outside battered the fuselage with the fury of 1,000 invisible fists. She could feel the tremor in the plane, a warning that the danger was escalating faster than anyone could prepare for. Maggie's fingers flew over the console. She was trained for precision under pressure, but now, with real lives at stake, the stakes were terrifyingly tangible. The engine alert had become more than a mechanical failure. It felt like a countdown. The pilot's words echoed in her mind, "We need you now." She glanced around the cabin, desperate for reassurance, and realized something even more alarming. Someone was watching. Maggie's trained instincts picked up subtle anomalies, a figure in first class shifting too deliberately, a man whose gaze lingered longer than casual curiosity should allow. Her stomach sank. Sabotage wasn't a drill. It wasn't a hypothetical scenario. Someone on this plane had intentions she couldn't yet see. Someone who had timed their actions with the storm and the mechanical failure. The reality hit her with cold, electric clarity. She was not just saving a plane. She was saving hundreds of lives from a threat that was alive, present, and calculating. Maggie's hands were steady, but her mind raced. She had to act. There was no margin for error. One wrong keystroke, 1 second's hesitation, and every life aboard Flight 472 could be lost. The pilot's voice, tense and urgent, broke through the hum of the engines and the crackling intercom. "Alpha Raven, this is not a drill. We are losing altitude. The autopilot is failing. I need you to stabilize it manually." Maggie's breath caught. Manual stabilization. She had trained for this in controlled environments, but never in a moving, storm-tossed plane with oblivious passengers unaware that their survival depended on her expertise. Her hands moved with a practiced rhythm over the console, inputting sequences, bypassing safety protocols, overriding systems, a delicate dance between control and chaos. And then she saw it, a small alert flashing red in the corner of the screen. "Engine critical, manual override required." Her stomach plummeted. The storm was more than wind and rain. Turbulence had escalated into an invisible enemy battering the plane's engines. The seconds stretched, elastic and cruel, each one weighted with potential disaster. Maggie's chest heaved as she whispered to herself, almost inaudible, a mantra drilled into her years ago: focus, precision, save lives. She tapped the final sequence. The plane shuddered violently, a scream of metal under stress, then slowly the vibration steadied. A surge of relief washed over her, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the danger was far from over. She allowed herself a single glance up at the passengers. Nobody had noticed. To them, this was just another stormy flight, but she knew differently. Row 9B, the seat she occupied, the nobody in the middle of the plane, that was the only difference between survival and catastrophe. And then in the cockpit, the pilot's voice came again, low and urgent. "Alpha Raven, there's something else. I can't explain it over the intercom, but you need to act fast and trust your instincts." Maggie's fingers froze mid-motion. Her breath hitched. Something else. Something unknown, something immediate, something that the pilot couldn't even voice without alarming the passengers. Her heart raced. The plane, the storm, the passengers, everything depended on her next move. She realized with a jolt. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm about to hit inside. And for the first time, Maggie understood that the life she thought she had left behind was very much alive, waiting for her to step into it, fully, utterly, without hesitation. Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she withdrew the small black device from her backpack, the cool metal pressing into her palms. She had trained for moments like this, moments where milliseconds separated life from disaster, but training in sterile, controlled environments could never prepare someone for the chaos of real human panic. She glanced down the aisle. Passengers were clutching armrests, their faces pale, unaware of how close they were to calamity. A toddler whimpered softly, tugging at its mother's sleeve, while an elderly woman muttered prayers under her breath. Each life felt impossibly fragile in that moment, each heartbeat a drum that pressed urgency into her chest. Her eyes flicked to the cockpit, where the pilot's expression was taut with tension. He keyed the intercom again, but this time only a whisper came through to her. "Alpha Raven, it's not just the engines. Someone tampered with the systems." Maggie's breath hitched. Sabotage. Her stomach dropped like a stone. The storm outside was only part of the danger. Someone aboard Flight 472 had orchestrated a threat from within. Her pulse thundered, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, to ground herself. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. Not here, not now. Her eyes scanned the cabin instinctively. Trained instincts she thought buried forever now surfaced with terrifying clarity. She noticed the subtle signs that the average passenger would miss: a man in first class repeatedly adjusting his tie, his gaze flicking nervously toward the cockpit. A passenger whose hands lingered a fraction too long over the overhead panel. A woman whose posture was too rigid, as though she were hiding something. Maggie's heart raced. Every detail mattered. Every moment counted. The plane jolted again, throwing a shudder through the cabin. Maggie gripped the console with both hands, her fingers flying over the keys as she accessed the cockpit's emergency interface. Engine diagnostics scrolled across the small screen, red warnings blinking like tiny warning sirens. She blocked out everything but the rhythm of her commands and the calculations running in her mind. Override sequences, bypass protocols, manual stabilization, all of it was coming back to her, each keystroke precise, practiced, instinctive. And then she saw it, the telltale signs of tampering. Someone had manually overridden part of the system, likely with malicious intent. It was sophisticated, methodical, and terrifyingly efficient. The realization struck her like a blow. The plane was not just at the mercy of the storm. It was at the mercy of someone who wanted disaster, and that disaster had been set in motion with careful planning. Maggie's stomach twisted. Her old life, the one she had thought she had left behind, was screaming at her now. Every skill she had buried under years of anonymity was needed, now, urgently. She allowed herself a single moment of recollection. The drills, the simulations, the countless hours spent learning to read behavior, anticipate sabotage, neutralize threats. Those memories, once hauntingly distant, now surged forward with a visceral immediacy. She tapped into the cockpit systems, cross-referencing the alerts with flight data. A second engine was showing irregular readings. The plane was losing stability. Maggie's mind raced, calculating variables, probabilities, contingencies. She knew the plane could hold together if she acted precisely, if she anticipated every possible outcome. One error, one hesitation, and the situation would spiral beyond control. Suddenly, the intercom clicked again. The pilot's voice, tight with anxiety, filtered through the cabin. "Alpha Raven, I'm losing altitude. Wind shear readings indicate severe turbulence ahead. You need to override the autopilot and stabilize manually." Maggie's breath caught. The storm outside was violent, yes, but this directive confirmed what she feared. The danger was immediate, and her intervention wasn't optional. She had to act, or hundreds of lives would be at risk. She pressed her lips together, the familiar clarity of mission-focused adrenaline cutting through fear. Her fingers moved with fluid precision over the black device. A sequence of code she hadn't touched in years was running under her fingertips as though her hands remembered the motions before her mind did. The plane lurched violently again, and Maggie's stomach dropped, but she forced herself to stay calm, to act with purpose. She reminded herself that hesitation was the enemy. Speed and precision were her only allies. Then a subtle movement caught her eye. A passenger in row 11, a man with dark glasses despite the overcast light outside, subtly shifted toward the aisle, glancing around nervously. His movements were small, calculated, deliberate. Maggie's heart sank. Sabotage wasn't just theory anymore. It was here, embodied in a human figure within reach of critical controls. Her pulse hammered as she considered her options. Confrontation could expose her prematurely, and any misstep might trigger disaster. She had to neutralize the threat without alerting anyone else. One wrong glance, one ill-timed action, and she could be overwhelmed. And yet she couldn't do nothing. Lives depended on her. The plane shook violently again, turbulence amplified by the storm, metal groaning under stress. Maggie's eyes darted to the cockpit interface, tracking the faltering engines. The code she was entering began to take effect. The first signs of stabilization appeared on the small screen, but then came another alert, interference from a source within the cabin. The system was compromised in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her breath came faster now, the tension coiling in her chest. She realized something chilling. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm she faced inside. Someone had intentionally placed Flight 472 in jeopardy, counting on the chaos to obscure their moves. And Maggie, quiet, unassuming Maggie Thompson in seat 9B, was the only person who could see the threads of this invisible danger, the only one trained to untangle them before it was too late. She leaned back slightly, scanning the cabin once more. Fear and recognition burned together. This was no ordinary flight. These were no ordinary passengers. And she, Alpha Raven, nobody in row 9, had been thrust back into the life she had worked so hard to leave behind. A final thought struck her with bone-deep clarity. She had been called not just to save the plane, but to confront a hidden threat that no one else even knew existed. Her pulse raced. Every second counted. Every choice was critical. And as the intercom clicked again, the pilot's hushed words pierced the cabin. "Alpha Raven, there's no time to explain, just act. Lives are counting on you." Maggie's fingers froze above the console. She swallowed hard, adrenaline coursing through her veins, and for the first time she fully recognized the reality of what she had to do. The plane, the storm, the hidden threat, it all rested on her shoulders. And in that moment, the line between her quiet, anonymous life and the lethal skills she had buried years ago blurred completely. Maggie Thompson was no longer a nobody. She was the only hope for every soul aboard Flight 472. Maggie Thompson's hands flew over the small black console like a pianist performing a furious, high-stakes symphony. The hum of the engines was louder now, punctuated by metal groaning, and the occasional sharp jolt of turbulence that rocked the plane violently. Each keystroke brought her closer to stabilizing the faltering engines, yet her instincts screamed that this was only the beginning. She could feel it, the hidden danger, invisible but present, weaving through the cabin like a predator circling its prey. Her eyes flicked over the cabin. Passengers were murmuring nervously, clutching seatbacks or glancing out the windows at the lightning-streaked storm. Some tried to soothe children who cried softly in confusion, while others buried their faces in phones or books, desperate to maintain a semblance of normalcy. To them, this was turbulence, a storm. But Maggie knew better. Something more sinister lurked aboard Flight 472, and every movement, every heartbeat mattered. She took a sharp breath, centering herself. Years of training she had hoped to leave behind now surged forward with uncanny precision. Scanning the cabin, she picked up the subtle signs. A passenger in first class, adjusting his tie nervously, watching the cockpit partition more than necessary. A woman whose hands lingered on her bag far longer than casual. A shadow moving too deliberately along the aisle. Sabotage wasn't a theory anymore. It was alive, present, and close. Maggie's fingers danced across the console, pulling up encrypted flight data, isolating the interference disrupting the engines. The red warnings blinked like ominous eyes. She traced the anomalies to a localized source, someone in the cabin. Her pulse spiked, but she forced herself to remain calm. Panic would be fatal. Focus was survival. She remembered the drills, the endless exercises, the simulations where she had neutralized threats under pressure. Everything she had learned, every instinct honed over years of covert operations, was now being tested for real, with real lives on the line. Her heart raced, but her mind was razor-sharp. This was no longer practice. This was reality. Suddenly, the plane lurched violently, throwing several passengers forward. A mother screamed as her child was jolted against the seat. A man cursed under his breath, and Maggie pressed herself against her seat, stabilizing her console. The turbulence was more than weather. The plane itself seemed to resist her control. The storm outside was merciless, but she knew that the real danger was inside. The sabotage had destabilized more than just the engines. It had injected chaos into the plane's systems, amplifying the natural turbulence into something deadly. Her thoughts raced. She had to act fast, but she couldn't alert the passengers. Any sign of panic could escalate the situation, potentially triggering more interference or giving the saboteur the upper hand. Maggie's training kicked in. Observe, isolate, neutralize, all without detection. She scanned the cabin again, noting minute behaviors, shifts in posture, the subtle tension in muscles that only someone trained could detect. Then it hit her. A sudden clarity, almost violent in its intensity. The saboteur wasn't random. The interference, the precise tampering, the storm, it was coordinated. Someone had studied this plane, this flight, these passengers, and they had counted on chaos to mask their moves. She realized with a chilling certainty that if she didn't act immediately, the plane would be beyond saving. Her hands moved with purpose over the console, initiating a controlled override of the compromised systems. Each command was critical. Each second was life or death. She focused on stabilizing the engines first, routing power through secondary systems, bypassing the interference. The console buzzed under her fingers, a symphony of warnings and beeps. She ignored the fear rising in her chest and trusted the instincts that had been drilled into her over years of silent preparation. A sudden jolt slammed the plane sideways, and a tray table clattered to the floor. Maggie's breath hitched, her knuckles white as she pressed a final command sequence. The engines groaned but responded, vibration lessening, systems beginning to stabilize. Relief surged for a fleeting second before reality struck again. The tampering wasn't over. Someone was actively manipulating the plane's systems from inside. Her mind raced. She had to find the source, but she couldn't leave her seat, couldn't risk leaving the console unattended. The saboteur was close, likely observing her now. One wrong glance, one wrong move, and he could trigger disaster. Maggie took a steadying breath, forcing herself to blend in with the oblivious passengers. She monitored everyone's behavior, noting subtle shifts, tiny indicators of stress and calculation. The storm outside intensified, lightning flashing through the windows in jagged bursts. Rain lashed against the fuselage, each strike a reminder of the fragility of their situation. The cabin lights flickered briefly, and Maggie felt her pulse accelerate. She had to act, but she had to act precisely. One error could mean death for everyone aboard. Then a subtle movement caught her attention. The man in first class, the one she had noted before, was now glancing repeatedly at the cockpit partition, fingers twitching as if ready to access something. Her stomach tightened. He was the source of the interference, and his presence confirmed the worst. This was deliberate, calculated, and he had a plan. Maggie's mind raced. She couldn't confront him directly. It would alert him and the chaos would spiral. But she could contain him, isolate the systems, and buy time to stabilize the plane. Her training kicked in fully now, years of muscle memory and instinct guiding her every decision. She initiated a lockdown sequence, diverting critical controls to a secure, isolated channel only she could access. The console beeped in response, acknowledging her command. A moment of tense stillness passed. The plane steadied slightly, the worst of the turbulence mitigated by her adjustments. Maggie's chest heaved, sweat beading her forehead, but she allowed herself only a fraction of relief. She knew the threat was still present. The saboteur was still active. The storm inside the cabin, human and mechanical, was far from over. Her gaze swept the cabin again, scanning, calculating, predicting. She understood now fully. Her life, her skills, her identity, all were back in play, all were necessary. Maggie Thompson, the nobody in row 9, was now the central figure in a deadly dance of human threat, technological sabotage, and nature's fury. And then the intercom clicked. The pilot's voice, strained and almost breathless, came through. "Alpha Raven, there's no time. They're moving faster than we thought. You need to contain it now." Maggie's hands froze above the console. Her mind raced. Every second counted. Every decision was critical. She swallowed hard, eyes narrowing, as realization crystallized in her chest. The storm outside was dangerous, yes, but the storm inside was far more lethal, and it was coming for them all. And with that realization, Maggie understood the unthinkable truth. She was not just fighting a failing plane. She was facing a deliberate threat within, and her next move could be the difference between life and death for everyone aboard Flight 472. Maggie Thompson's fingers flew across the small black console, each keystroke precise, honed by years of training that had once been her entire life. Her heart pounded like a drumbeat in her chest, but her mind was sharp, calculating, decisive. The storm outside shook the plane violently, metal groaning under stress, passengers screaming and clutching armrests, but Maggie's focus was on something far deadlier than weather. The saboteur hidden somewhere on board. She traced the interference in the cockpit systems, narrowing it down to a specific source. The man in first class, the one whose subtle movements she had tracked, was the key. He had tampered with the plane's internal systems, causing fluctuations that threatened to destabilize both engines. She couldn't confront him directly without risking a panic that could trigger him to act immediately. She had to neutralize the threat silently, efficiently, and quickly. Her training kicked in fully now. Years of drills, simulations, and covert operations surged back into muscle memory. She activated a lockdown sequence through her console, rerouting critical control channels to a secure, isolated loop only she could access. The red warnings on the interface slowly started to stabilize. One engine's failure was now contained, but the second remained vulnerable, delicate, unstable, and still under interference. Maggie pressed herself against her seat, scanning the cabin again. Every passenger was oblivious to the hidden danger. To them, this was just turbulence and a stormy flight. But Maggie's eyes were sharp, trained to read subtle tells, shifts in weight, micro-expressions, minor hesitations. She saw the man's fingers twitching near the overhead panel, and a surge of adrenaline spiked in her chest. He was ready to act again. Every second that passed without intervention increased the risk exponentially. She reached into her backpack and retrieved a small, specialized device, a sleek, black tablet-like console equipped to interface with the plane's internal wiring remotely. It was her lifeline, her leverage. She deployed it carefully on her lap, keeping it hidden under the tray table. A few precise inputs, and she could override the saboteur's actions, contain the threat, and stabilize the systems, but only if she was flawless. Any error, any miscalculation, and the plane could tip into chaos instantly. A violent jolt shook the aircraft, slamming a tray table against the back of her seat. Maggie's fingers moved faster. The storm outside rattled the fuselage with relentless fury, wind and rain lashing against the windows in jagged sheets. Lightning flashed, illuminating the terrified faces of passengers. Children cried, and adults murmured reassurances they barely believed themselves. Maggie ignored it all. She couldn't afford to lose focus. Her eyes tracked the saboteur once more. The man's gaze flicked toward the cockpit, then back to the aisle, measuring the distance, calculating timing. She realized he had planned this meticulously, the interference, the tampering, the precise moments of chaos. And now he was counting on confusion to give him control. Maggie's stomach tightened. She had to act, and she had to act decisively. She initiated the first move. Using her device, she discreetly sent a targeted override signal to the sections of the plane's internal network the saboteur had manipulated. It was subtle, undetectable by anyone not trained, a ghost of intervention that would slowly regain control of the systems. The plane's engines groaned under the strain, and the red warnings flickered but did not disappear. She needed more precision, more speed. A sudden jolt pitched the plane to the side. Maggie grabbed the console with both hands, keeping it steady on her lap. She could feel the vibration through the seat, through her bones. A passenger screamed near the front, and the man in first class looked momentarily up, scanning the cabin. Maggie's heart raced. He hadn't noticed her yet, but he could. One glance, one recognition, and her cover and everyone's safety could be compromised. Her fingers flew again, entering a sequence that would reroute the plane's critical controls entirely through her secure interface. The console beeped in acknowledgement. Slowly, the vibrations began to lessen. One engine began to stabilize. The second was still precarious, but she could feel the systems responding. Relief was tempting, but she couldn't allow herself to relax. Not yet. The man in first class shifted again, glancing toward the cockpit. Maggie realized he had noticed some irregularity, perhaps the delayed response of the systems, perhaps the subtle way her actions countered his tampering. His lips twitched, almost a smirk. He was calculating, and now he had recognized resistance. Maggie's chest tightened. The next few seconds would define everything. She adjusted her position slightly, keeping the console hidden while initiating a secondary override. This sequence would isolate the saboteur's access, cutting off his ability to manipulate the plane without drawing attention. She held her breath as the system processed the commands. Lights flickered briefly, the plane shuddered, and the hum of the engines shifted, a subtle sign that control was returning to her. Maggie's pulse pounded. The storm outside and the threat inside were converging, each jolt a reminder of how fragile the situation was. She monitored the saboteur carefully, watching for any sign that he had realized what she was doing. Every passenger was still unaware of the danger. The tension in the cabin was palpable, yet invisible. A flash of lightning illuminated the man's face. His eyes narrowed as he realized someone was interfering with his sabotage. He leaned slightly forward, reaching for the overhead panel again. Maggie's stomach lurched. She had anticipated this. With a swift, precise tap on her console, she locked the network segment he was about to access. The system responded instantly, cutting off his ability to make changes. The man froze, then sat back, momentarily frustrated. He didn't know it, but his window of control had closed. Maggie exhaled slowly, though only for a fraction of a second. She had bought precious time, but the threat was far from neutralized. The storm outside was still raging, and the second engine remained unstable. Every second counted, and the saboteur was still present, still dangerous, still calculating. The plane shuddered again, a violent jolt that threw Maggie forward slightly. Her hand stayed steady, her mind razor-focused. One thing was clear. She was no longer the quiet, unassuming passenger in row 9. She was Alpha Raven, the only line of defense, the person everyone unknowingly depended on. The intercom crackled. The pilot's voice came through, taut with urgency. Alpha Raven, systems stabilizing, but we're still losing altitude. You need to maintain control. The saboteur is still active. I can't hold this alone. Maggie's heart raced. This was the moment she had been trained for, the moment she had feared and longed for simultaneously. She adjusted her console, isolating remaining interference and focusing on stabilizing the plane manually. Every tap, every sequence, every movement was critical. The plane groaned under stress. The storm rattled the fuselage, but slowly, imperceptibly, control began to return to her. And then, from the back of her mind, a chilling thought surfaced. The saboteur had anticipated resistance. He wasn't just reacting, he was planning the next move. Maggie's stomach tightened. This was far from over. The storm outside howled, the plane shuddered, and the man in first class leaned back slightly, a faint smirk returning to his lips. Maggie's pulse raced as she realized the fight was far from over, and the next move she made would define whether Flight 472 survived the next deadly moment. Maggie Thompson pressed herself against her seat, gripping the small black console on her lap, her breath coming in shallow, controlled bursts. The storm outside had escalated, lightning splitting the sky in jagged lines, rain lashing against the fuselage like hammers. The plane groaned under stress, tilting violently as turbulence became more than just wind. It was a battering force, testing the limits of every structural joint. But Maggie's attention was not on the weather. It was on the threat inside the cabin, the invisible hand destabilizing Flight 472. Her eyes scanned the rows, trained and precise. The passengers were oblivious to the real danger. Children whimpered softly, adults murmured reassurances they barely believed, and the occasional flash of lightning illuminated faces pale with fear. None of them knew that someone on board was orchestrating disaster with deadly intent. Maggie's pulse raced as she tracked the man in first class, the saboteur. His posture, subtle movements, the way his fingers lingered near the overhead compartment, all screamed danger. The console on her lap beeped urgently. The second engine, still unstable, was starting to show signs of interference again. The red warning light flashed, a relentless heartbeat of looming catastrophe. Maggie's stomach tightened. She could stabilize it temporarily, but the sabotage was sophisticated, adaptive, and it was reacting to her moves. Whoever had done this knew planes, knew technology, and knew exactly how to exploit chaos. Maggie's hands moved with speed and precision, tapping a series of override commands to contain the interference. The plane shuddered violently, throwing a loose water bottle across the aisle. A scream echoed from the rear of the cabin. Maggie's eyes flicked to the source, a woman clutching a sleeping infant, oblivious to the invisible battle raging above her head. Maggie's throat tightened. One misstep, one hesitation, and disaster would be inevitable. Her mind raced through possible scenarios. The saboteur wasn't acting randomly. He was calculating, anticipating her every move. Maggie had to predict, intercept, and neutralize, all without drawing attention. She adjusted her console, isolating the plane's critical systems in a secure loop she alone could control. Slowly, imperceptibly, the red warning lights started to stabilize. Then it happened. The man in first class shifted abruptly, glancing toward the cockpit, then down the aisle. His eyes narrowed as if sensing resistance. Maggie's pulse jumped. He had noticed something, the subtle delays in the systems, the way control seemed to slip from his grasp. He was clever, patient, and dangerous. She had no time to confront him directly, and any overt action could trigger immediate disaster. Her instincts screamed. She needed to act subtly, surgically. Maggie deployed a secondary override, this one more advanced, routing the plane's critical controls through a hidden channel that the saboteur couldn't access. The system beeped in acknowledgement. She could feel the control returning to her, but the saboteur's presence was still a threat, looming like a predator over the oblivious passengers. The plane pitched violently, lightning flashing through the windows. Rain streamed down, the fuselage rattling. Maggie's knuckles whitened as she held the console steady, recalibrating systems, stabilizing the engines. She caught a movement out of the corner of her eye. The saboteur was reaching again, this time for a small panel beneath his seat. His intentions were clear. He was going to interfere manually. Maggie's stomach dropped. She had anticipated this, but it was a dangerous gamble. She couldn't leave her console. She had to maintain control. She leaned slightly, sending a targeted override to the specific network segment the saboteur was about to access. The system responded instantly. A subtle warning flashed on her console: intrusion blocked. The man froze, frustrated, his plans thwarted for now. But Maggie knew it was temporary. He was still calculating, still dangerous. She had slowed him down, but she hadn't neutralized him. The storm outside and the turbulence inside were relentless, the two forces colliding, testing her limits. Sweat beaded on her forehead as her fingers flew over the console, inputting complex sequences designed to stabilize the plane fully while keeping the saboteur contained. The plane shuddered again, violently this time, throwing passengers forward. Maggie pressed herself back, heart hammering, eyes locked on her console. The override sequence was almost complete, but just as she tapped the final command, a loud bang echoed from the rear of the cabin. A sudden, metallic snap, followed by the sound of something heavy falling to the floor. Passengers screamed. Panic spread like wildfire. Maggie's heart leapt into her throat. The saboteur had made a move, something she hadn't anticipated. Her pulse raced and her mind flew through options. She could stabilize the engines, yes, but now there was an active, immediate physical threat moving through the cabin. Her gaze flicked to the cockpit. The pilot's hands gripped the controls, eyes wide with fear, unaware that the threat was not only mechanical but human. He shouted something into the headset, but Maggie barely registered it. She was already moving in her mind, calculating the next sequence, preparing for the next step that could save lives or doom them all. Then she realized the unthinkable. The man had a partner. Someone else was moving, stealthy, synchronized with his actions, and their combined interference was more sophisticated than she had anticipated. Maggie's stomach sank. This was no longer a simple sabotage. This was a coordinated attack, a battle against unknown adversaries whose intent was nothing short of disaster. Her hands flew over the console again, implementing a more advanced override, isolating multiple control channels and sealing off segments of the plane's systems from external manipulation. It was delicate work, and the engines groaned under the strain. The red warning lights blinked and flickered, some dimming slightly, others stubbornly resisting. She held her breath, aware that the next jolt could undo everything she had done. Lightning struck nearby, illuminating the cabin in jagged bursts. Maggie's eyes scanned the saboteur, who was now crouched near the aisle, tense, calculating, frustrated. His partner remained hidden, shadowing the plane undetected by passengers. The storm outside and the danger inside were closing in, and Maggie understood fully. This was a fight she could not afford to lose. Every second, every breath, every decision mattered. The intercom clicked again. The pilot's voice, tight with urgency, echoed in her ears. "Alpha Raven, we've got one chance to stabilize the plane. The interference is escalating. You need to act now before it's too late." Maggie's hands froze above the console. Her mind raced. She was running out of time. The storm outside raged, the saboteur was active, the partner was unknown, and the plane's systems teetered on the edge of catastrophe. And then a flash of realization hit her. This wasn't just about stabilizing engines or overriding systems. This was about anticipating human behavior, predicting the next move of a calculated adversary, and confronting a threat she couldn't even fully see. Maggie swallowed hard, her pulse surging. The storm outside, the chaos inside, the ticking clock of the plane's survival, it all converged into a single, terrifying truth. If she didn't act decisively, Flight 472 would not survive. And as another violent jolt threw the plane sideways, Maggie's eyes narrowed, her hands poised over the console, knowing the next move she made would determine the fate of every passenger on board. Maggie Thompson's fingers hovered over the console, poised and ready, heart hammering in her chest. Every ounce of training she had buried in her quiet, nobody life surged to the surface with razor-sharp clarity. She was Alpha Raven now, the line between disaster and survival. The storm outside battered the plane relentlessly, rain slicing past windows like knives, lightning illuminating terrified faces with jagged brilliance. But the most dangerous storm was inside, the saboteur and his hidden partner moving like shadows, invisible yet lethal. The man in first class shifted again, reaching toward a panel beneath his seat. Maggie's pulse spiked. Her console confirmed it. He was actively manipulating a secondary control system, a deliberate interference that could destabilize the plane instantly. The red warnings flared. The engines groaned. One wrong move could doom everyone aboard Flight 472. Maggie inhaled, steadying herself. This was the moment her instincts, her skills, and her courage had been preparing for her entire life. She couldn't just react. She had to anticipate, neutralize, and reclaim control. Slowly, deliberately, she leaned slightly forward, keeping the console hidden from the man's line of sight. Her fingers danced over the keys, initiating a targeted override designed to block his access. The man froze, frustration evident in the subtle tightening of his jaw. Maggie could almost feel his mental calculation. He had realized resistance, but not its source. He didn't see her. He hadn't guessed that the quiet, unassuming passenger in row 9 was the one countering him. The thrill of that invisibility gave Maggie a fraction of breathing room. But the pause was short-lived. Suddenly, a shadow shifted near the rear of the cabin. Maggie's stomach sank. The partner. Someone else had been orchestrating interference from another location, their actions synchronized with the first saboteur. Panic and adrenaline collided in her chest. The threat was no longer just one person. It was coordinated, deliberate, and deadly. Maggie's mind raced. She had to split her focus between stabilizing the engines and neutralizing multiple threats, all while maintaining secrecy and calm. One passenger noticing a struggle could trigger chaos, and one misstep could lead to catastrophe. She activated the secondary override across the plane's systems, routing critical functions through a hidden channel she alone could control. The console beeped in acknowledgement. Slowly, she felt the plane respond, vibration decreasing slightly, engines humming more steadily. The man in first class growled under his breath and leaned forward, fingers twitching, trying another panel. Maggie anticipated the move. She adjusted her console with practiced precision, sealing off the section he was attempting to access. A surge of adrenaline raced through her veins. She had slowed him, contained him, but she knew it wouldn't last. His frustration was palpable, his movements increasingly erratic, yet he remained dangerously aware, ready for the next strike. Lightning illuminated the cabin again, briefly exposing the man's face. His eyes narrowed in suspicion, scanning the rows of passengers, searching for an unknown source. Maggie's pulse raced. Any glance toward her could reveal everything. She shifted slightly, keeping her posture casual, her hands on the console. Her cover remained intact, but the tension was suffocating. Then the unmistakable sound of a small device activating reached her ears, a click followed by a faint whir. The partner had deployed something. Maggie's stomach tightened. The interference was intensifying. She tapped her console furiously, rerouting more control lines, stabilizing systems manually. The plane groaned, pitched violently, and passengers screamed. Panic rippled across the cabin. Maggie's eyes flicked to the cockpit. The pilot was shouting into his headset, hands tight on the controls, unaware of the human threat lurking within. Her mind raced, evaluating options. She couldn't physically confront both saboteurs without risking exposure, but she could manipulate the systems, isolate them, and create a digital trap. She initiated a calculated override, rerouting the secondary control network entirely through her secure channel. The plane responded immediately. The engines hummed with regained stability, the red warnings flickered and diminished, and the secondary interference was blocked. The man in first class froze, realizing something was wrong. He glanced toward the rear, toward his partner. The shadow shifted, hesitation evident. Maggie had split their coordination. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and she could push both out of the sequence while keeping the engine stable. She held her breath, calculating timing down to milliseconds. Then she made her move. Using the console, she sent a final override, locking both sabotage points. The man's fingers twitched in disbelief. His partner tried to compensate, but the system responded only to Maggie. The plane shuddered, but control was firmly in her hands. She exhaled slowly, barely audible, as she felt the tension in the fuselage begin to ease. But relief was fleeting. The storm outside had not relented. Lightning flashed directly against the fuselage, the roar of thunder shaking the plane violently. One engine, though stabilized, still groaned under stress. The other had responded to her override but remained delicate, the system still teetering at the edge of failure. And the saboteurs, while contained digitally, were not neutralized physically. They could still act, could still create chaos. Her pulse thundered as she weighed the situation. She was Alpha Raven, fully in control of the plane's systems. She had outmaneuvered her adversaries, contained the sabotage, and stabilized the engines for now. But she knew instinctively, chillingly, that the next seconds would test her limits more than any prior challenge. The intercom clicked. The pilot's voice, strained, urgent, broke through. Alpha Raven systems responding, but we're still in danger. Saboteurs are active, turbulence worsening. You're our only chance. Maggie's eyes narrowed. The storm outside, the human threat, the failing engines, everything converged. She could feel the plane's metal tremble beneath her, the lives of hundreds hanging in a delicate balance. The saboteurs were still present, still calculating, still dangerous. Her hands hovered over the console, poised for the next critical action. And then, in a flash of terrifying clarity, Maggie realized something she hadn't expected. One of the saboteurs was moving directly toward her row. The quiet, calculated approach of a trained operative, deliberate, precise, and deadly. Her pulse surged. The moment of confrontation was here. The fight for control, for survival, for Flight 472 itself had reached its apex. And in that split second, Maggie knew that everything, every life, every second, every decision depended entirely on what she did next. Maggie Thompson's heart pounded so violently she could feel it in her throat. The man in first class, the saboteur she had been tracking for hours, was now moving with lethal precision toward her row. Every passenger around her was oblivious to the deadly tension inches from their heads. Children whimpered quietly, mothers tried to soothe them, and the storm outside roared as if it knew the chaos brewing inside the cabin. Maggie's fingers hovered over the console, every nerve in her body coiled tight like a spring. The saboteur's eyes narrowed, sharp and calculating. He hadn't expected resistance, and his frustration was visible in the twitch of his jaw. But he was still dangerous, still capable of forcing the plane into disaster. Maggie's mind raced. She had stabilized the engines, blocked his digital interference, but now came the most delicate part, neutralizing him without creating panic, without giving him the opportunity to retaliate. She leaned subtly, keeping her console hidden, her movements precise. Years of training, covert operations, tactical simulations, split-second decisions, all fused into instinct. She could not afford hesitation. One wrong move and Flight 472 would become a tomb. She allowed herself a single, fleeting thought. She had survived moments like this before, but never with hundreds of innocent lives depending on her. The saboteur reached the aisle, stepping carefully, almost methodically. He glanced at nearby passengers, ensuring they were oblivious, calculating every angle. Maggie's pulse raced. She could see the plan forming in his mind, a final act of sabotage, a deadly strike to seize control physically. She had seconds, maybe less, to intercept. Then lightning illuminated the cabin. For a fraction of a second, the world froze. Maggie's eyes locked on his, and he finally recognized her not just as a passenger, but as the invisible force blocking him. His smirk faltered, replaced with a flicker of calculation. He had underestimated her. Maggie acted. With fluid precision, she ducked under the tray table, springing to the aisle with the kind of speed and control only years of training could produce. Her voice, low but commanding, cut through the tension. "Stop. Now." The man froze, shocked, and for the first time hesitation cracked his composure. But he was not easily deterred. He lunged toward the panel beneath his seat, intent on final interference. Maggie anticipated him, sliding across the aisle and using her momentum to block his access, her hands gripping his shoulders and twisting just enough to redirect his motion without alerting nearby passengers. The struggle was brief but intense. Every second mattered. The plane shuddered violently under turbulence, throwing Maggie and the saboteur slightly off balance. She held him, leverage and instinct guiding her movements, knowing she had to neutralize the threat immediately. Her mind raced through contingencies: restrain, incapacitate, prevent access to systems. Every calculation was critical. Failure meant catastrophe. He struggled, attempting to shove her aside, but Maggie was stronger than he anticipated. Years of covert training gave her control over a single moment, enough to dominate, enough to redirect his actions. With a swift, calculated motion, she pushed him toward an empty row, leveraging the aisle and the plane's narrow space to contain him. Meanwhile, the plane groaned under the storm's assault, engines humming with the delicate balance Maggie had restored. Red warning lights flickered, then dimmed slightly as systems stabilized under her override. She didn't glance away from the saboteur. He could recover, he could fight back, and the secondary partner's presence was still unconfirmed. Her focus had to remain absolute. Maggie leaned close, whispering with icy precision, "One move and everyone dies. Do you understand?" The man froze, tension radiating from his frame. In that split second, she could see the calculation in his eyes. He understood, and the fight drained from him just enough to allow Maggie to secure him further. She twisted his hands behind his back, using his own momentum against him, and immobilized him against the aisle wall. The storm's roar drowned out any struggle, hiding the confrontation from panicked passengers. But then movement from the rear caught her eye. The partner. A shadow shifting between seats, subtle, careful. Maggie's pulse jumped again. She had to anticipate a second threat, another potential saboteur, perhaps more dangerous now that the first was contained. With a controlled breath, she tapped a few final commands into her console, initiating a lockdown on the plane's secondary systems. The engine stabilized further, the red warning lights gradually receding, and control flowed seamlessly through her channel. Systems now completely secured, the digital threat neutralized. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the cabin in jagged bursts. Maggie's eyes swept the rows, scanning passengers, scanning shadows. The partner had hesitated. The system she had locked down prevented any further tampering. Slowly, the shadow moved, then retreated, realizing their control was gone. Maggie allowed herself a fraction of relief, though her body remained tense. She glanced back at the saboteur. Sweat beaded his brow, eyes wide with disbelief and fear. He had underestimated the nobody in row 9, and now he realized the full scale of her skills. Maggie's pulse still raced, adrenaline coursing through every vein, but she felt the first spark of victory. The immediate threat was contained, and Flight 472 was no longer on the verge of disaster. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, strained but audible. "Alpha Raven, the engines are stable. You saved us." Maggie's lips pressed into a thin line. There was no time for relief yet. She guided the saboteur to a seated, restrained position, keeping him calm but immobilized until authorities could intervene upon landing. The storm outside remained, but the plane's systems now hummed with reliable stability. She monitored, calculated, and adjusted as necessary, ensuring the journey remained secure. Passengers began to murmur, sensing that the worst turbulence had passed. Children stopped crying. Adults exchanged wary glances, unaware of the invisible battle that had just been fought and won. Maggie allowed herself a slow exhale. The adrenaline still coursed, but she could finally allow the tiniest hint of calm. She glanced at the console, at the stabilized engines, at the subdued saboteur. Flight 472 was safe, for now. And though her identity remained a secret to the passengers, she knew that her life, her training, and the courage she had thought forgotten had made the difference between life and death. The intercom clicked again. The pilot's voice, softer now, almost reverent, said, "Alpha Raven will never forget this. Thank you." Maggie leaned back in her seat, fingers trembling slightly, eyes scanning the cabin one last time. She allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The storm had passed, the sabotage had been contained, and hundreds of lives were intact, because a nobody in row 9 had become the only hope in a desperate, impossible moment. And as the plane leveled, engine steady, passengers beginning to whisper relief, Maggie Thompson allowed herself the faintest smile. She was no longer invisible. She was Alpha Raven, the silent guardian who had faced chaos, confronted danger, and saved Flight 472. The storm outside raged on, but inside, calm had returned for now.